They said the Caldwell estate was a gift, an inheritance from a forgotten father. But behind its locked doors, I found a ledger, not of money, but of names. Children, vanished, traded. For 93 years, not a single debt was paid. Until now. They told me the house would feel like mine the moment I stepped inside. That something about blood and soil and name would wrap around me like a birthright I'd never known I needed. But as I turned the old brass key in the lock and pushed open the door to the Caldwell estate for the first time in 18 years, all I felt was cold, a slow, climbing chill that spread to my spine like a hand curling around my ribcage, not violent, not angry, just patient and possessive. The house didn't welcome me. It recognized me, and I hated how familiar that recognition felt. How the scent of aging wood and varnish, of rain-damp stone and something faintly metallic in the air, could still trigger the ghost of my father's cologne, and the brittle sharpness of my grandmother's voice telling me to sit up straight and smile for the family portraits that lined the main hallway like ancestors watching for signs of deviation. I hadn't been here since I was 12, since the day I packed a single duffel bag and walked out with my mother's hand crushing mine, and a silence so thick between us it felt like tar. And yet now, at 30, I stood at the same threshold alone, summoned not by love or duty, but by a sterile legal letter that had arrived 2 weeks after my father's funeral, informing me, in polite serif font, that I was now the sole heir to the Caldwell estate and all associated holdings. As though it were an award and not a sentence, I hadn't gone to the funeral, not out of cruelty, but because there was no grief left in me for a man who had buried his kindness in ledgers and tradition, who'd spoken in conditions and contracts even at dinner, who believed inheritance was not earned or gifted but owed, as though debt ran in our blood. Stepping into the foyer was like sinking into a memory I didn't want. The walls taller than I remembered, the chandelier above still veiled in dust and cobwebs, the marble floor still gleaming with the obsessive polish of hired hands. Long since dismissed, there was no staff now, no welcoming committee, only the sound of my boots echoing to the high ceilings as I moved further in, heart racing not with fear, but with a way to finally return to the place where so much had gone unsaid. I had told myself this was temporary, that I was here to assess, to document, to sell, cut ties cleanly and move on. But as the hours passed, as I wandered through each room with the meticulous numbness of a museum curator, I began to feel that familiar tug beneath the skin, the one that says you're not alone even when you know you are, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching, not in a supernatural way, not in the flickering lights, creaking doors way, but with memory, with the embedded presence of generations who had walked these same floors and made decisions in the dark and called it family. I found the study locked, just like I remembered, and it took me 3 hours of combing through drawers and bookshelves to find a hidden latch behind a portrait of Elias Caldwell, my great-grandfather, whose stern expression had always made me feel like I was being measured and found lacking. The latch released a hidden compartment containing a ring of keys, each one labeled in a neat script that made my stomach twist. Study, cellar, ledger, north tower, chapel, and the presence of those words alone made my breath catch, because I had never heard of a chapel, and the term ledger felt too deliberate to be coincidence. I unlocked the study with the key labeled study and pushed open a heavy oak door, and the smell hit me first. Aged paper, ink old tobacco, and the unmistakable scent of iron and something acrid, like scorched fabric or dry blood long since faded into wood grain. The room was dim, the curtains drawn, but even in the low light I could see the order, the meticulous arrangement of books and journals and antique clocks, all ticking in dissonant rhythm as though time itself had fragmented within these walls. The desk was covered in papers, none recent, but all in my father's handwriting. Lists, notes, financial breakdowns, and letters addressed to names I didn't recognize, but all signed with scrawled C that sent a jolt through me because it wasn't his initials, but Elias's, and I realized with a slow, creeping unease that these weren't my father's papers. They were transcriptions, copies, continuations of something older, something preserved like scripture, and the deeper I dug, the more I found. Notebooks with pages numbered in Roman numerals, each filled with dense, clinical language about assets, obligations, and balancing, and not a single line of emotional prose, not one phrase that sounded like my father's voice, and I understood then that he'd spent the last years of his life continuing something, maintaining something, a system that didn't belong to him but to the name itself, Caldwell. I tried to leave the room, tried to clear my head and step into daylight, but the door had swung shut behind me and stuck, the kind of old with swelling, I told myself, though my hand shook as I jiggled the knob, and for a long minute I stood there, trapped in a room that felt more like a confession booth than an office, and when the door finally opened with a groan, I stepped into the hall and looked back, half expecting to see someone standing behind the desk, but of course there was no one, only the weight of presence and inheritance, heavy and invisible and utterly inescapable. That night I couldn't sleep, not because of fear, but because I kept remembering a phrase my grandmother had once whispered to me during one of those long, silent dinners. We don't pay for what we take, Eloise. We raise it instead. At the time, I thought she meant our horses, our land, our family values, but now, years later, standing alone in a house full of locked rooms and unspoken systems, I wasn't so sure, and when I finally drifted off in the guest room I'd chosen on the second floor, I dreamed of a ledger that never balanced, of names written in red ink and circled with lines that bled off the page, of voices whispering not in malice, but in expectation, and I woke with a feeling that I had already agreed to. Something I hadn't yet understood, but that the house knew I would soon learn. The next morning I woke to silence so thick it felt padded, like the air itself had been muffled overnight, and as I sat up in the narrow bed of the guest room I'd chosen more for its distance from the main staircase than any real sense of comfort, I realized that the stillness of the Caldwell estate wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of waiting, like the house was holding its breath for my next move. I dressed slowly, methodically, every motion feeling heavy with implication, and before I even reached the hallway, I knew where I was going. Not out into the town, not call the lawyers, but back into the study, drawn by the quiet magnetism of those ledgers and keys, by the unfinished architecture of secrets I'd only begun to map. I unlocked the door again, this time more easily, as though the wood had relaxed its resistance in anticipation. And I crossed the threshold with a kind of reluctant reverence, my eyes immediately drawn not to the desk this time, but to the far wall where a tall cabinet stood, plain, unadorned, and locked with a brass padlock that bore the same initials I'd seen the day before. You see, I tried the key-marked ledger and felt the lock yield with a reluctant click, and when I pulled the doors open, I was met with rows of identical leather-bound volumes, dozens of them, perfectly aligned, each marked by decade 1890 to 1899, 1900 to 1909, and so on up through 1990 to 1999, with the final book labeled simply Ongoing, and as I pulled that last volume down, I felt a strange flutter in my chest. Not quite fear, but something adjacent to awe, the kind of trembling reverence one might feel while holding an unmarked grave ledger or a priest's diary from a parish that had long since burned down. The book was heavier than expected. The leather cracked but soft beneath my fingertips, and when I opened it, I found not numbers or accounts in the usual sense, but names, rows and rows of them, written in a script so consistent it seemed mechanical, each name followed by a year, a location, and a single word, paid, settled, cleared, or in some cases, simply pending. And as I turned the pages, my breath caught when I recognized some surnames. Branwell, Hatcher, Fontaine, names of families that lived in town, names I had heard my father mutter during heated calls or in the aftermath of long silences that followed his return from town meetings. I scanned the pages faster, and the pattern became clearer. These were not debts in the traditional sense, but markers of exchange, of something transferred and then resolved, and the more I read, the more I realized there were no Caldwell names in the book, no mentions of the family paying anything back, ever, only entries of people outside the family settling balances, one way or another. I flipped to the final pages and found a more recent entry, my father's handwriting, unmistakably shakier than the previous script, recording the name Eloise Caldwell, pending. And I froze, the room spinning briefly as I reread the line again and again, unable to comprehend why my name would appear in a ledger that had never once recorded a Caldwell as a debtor. I felt a chill move through me as I replaced the book on the shelf and turned back to the room, suddenly seeing it differently. The symmetry of the books, the locked drawers, the odd gap in the flooring beneath the cabinet that seemed too deliberate to be structural. This wasn't just a study. It was a sanctum, a place where some ancient economy had been preserved, where power was not just inherited, but tracked, documented, and passed like an unspoken pact. I began pulling the other volumes down, skimming names and annotations, and the entries became darker the further back I went. Notations of satisfaction by estate transfer, resolved by arrangement, and one that made my stomach turn. Debtor's child accepted in lieu, and next to it, a small triangle drawn in red ink, the only symbol I'd seen so far. And when I looked again, I realized there were dozens of those triangles scattered across the older volumes, always beside names that appear to be children's or followed by vague locations. Orchard Glen, North Barn, Westwood, as if the locations were familiar to the record keeper and needed no elaboration. I sat down hard on the study chair, my legs suddenly weak, and I felt the weight of something vast and cruel settling over me, a history not written in headlines or public scandals, but hidden within the private language of a family that had never paid for anything in money, but had always got what they wanted, always come out ahead. And now I could see why. The ledger wasn't a record of debts. It was a record of offerings of exchanges that the town had allowed, that the Caldwells had managed, and that I, by virtue of blood and timing and silence, was now heir to. I closed the cabinet slowly and locked again, not to hide it from others, but to keep myself from diving further into it before I was ready, because I could feel the edge of obsession rising in me, the dangerous allure of understanding too much too quickly, and I needed time to process what I'd seen, to let it sink into my bones gradually, like a slow infection instead of a wound ripped open all at once. I left the study and wandered the house in a daze, passing rooms that once meant nothing but now felt thick with implication. The parlor with its mismatched portrait wall, the conservatory with its cracked floor tiles shaped like stars, the pantry lined with rusted hooks that had never quite looked right for food. I ended up back in the main hall, staring at the family crest carved above the entryway, an ornate shield flanked by two birds and a tree with roots exposed, and beneath it, the motto I'd never bothered to read before, Quod tolliter redditor. I looked it up later that night, staring at the Latin phrase as it loaded on my phone screen with slow, heavy inevitability. What is taken must be returned, and I realized then that the Caldwell wealth had never been stolen. It had been borrowed, acquired through agreements unspoken and unseen, and maintained through a quiet, generational vigilance that kept the balance tilted, not through violence or theft, but through obligation, silence, and the kind of debt that isn't measured in coin, but in consequence. The next morning, the house felt quieter, not empty, but subdued in a different way, as if it sensed my understanding and decided to watch, rather than resist. And as I stood at the kitchen window, staring out over the neglected garden, a place I remembered vaguely from childhood as being filled with statues and overgrown hedges, an occasional gardener who never spoke above a whisper, I realized I could no longer pretend that what I found in the ledger room was just an oddity, a relic of old bookkeeping. It was too deliberate, too precise, too consistent, and most of all, too present, because my name was in it, pending like a bill not yet collected or a task left unfinished. And that word followed me as I drove into town, needing to see the world beyond this state with new eyes, needing to know if this wasn't just a house of secret, but community shame. The town hadn't changed much in the 18 years since I'd left. Same brick sidewalks, same faded storefronts, same sense of time held in amber. But now every smile seemed thinner, every nod slightly delayed, as if recognition came with reluctance rather than warmth. And I saw in the eyes of the old butcher who used to give me paper-wrapped candies as a child, and a librarian who once hosted story hours in the church annex, an almost imperceptible shift in their gaze when I introduced myself again, a brief tightening of the jaw, a stuttered pause before the words Caldwell left my mouth and hung in the air like smoke. I started asking questions gently about the estate, about my father, about the history of the Caldwell name. And at first the responses were cautious, polite deflections. Well, old families have their quirks. Or, your folks kept themselves, didn't they? But as I pressed, offering nothing accusatory, only curiosity wrapped in nostalgia, the tone changed. No one would speak plainly, but the gaps in conversation became more telling than the words themselves. A silence when I mentioned the names in the ledgers, a sudden need to tend to something in the back when I showed photos of the ledger entries, and most disturbingly, a repeated phrase I heard from 3 different people in the span of an afternoon. Some debts don't take cash. The first time I heard it, I thought it was a strange metaphor, but by the third, I felt sick because it was spoken with a kind of tired resignation, like a truth everyone knew but had long since accepted as too old, too tangled, too dangerous to confront. At the diner, I met a woman named Clara who had known my grandmother and, after some hesitant small talk, agreed to meet me later that evening at the library's archive room. "Off the record," she said, her eyes flicking nervously toward the booth behind me, where a group of older men had suddenly gone quiet. She arrived late, her face pale and drawn, carrying a manila folder wrapped in twine. And as we sat in the dim light of the back room, surrounded by Brittletown ledgers and local newsletters, she told me that her cousin had once worked at the Caldwell estate, years ago, cleaning and inventorying antiques, and that she had quit suddenly after stumbling across a room she was never meant to find. Just a room with papers, names, all neatly written out like tombstones, and that not long after quitting, she disappeared, no police report, no public search, just gone, and the family never spoke of her again. Clara said she found one letter, never mailed, in which her cousin described names that vanish, dates that don't make sense, and people who stop asking questions once a Caldwell writes them down. And as she slid the folder across the table, I realized that within it were copies of local obituaries. Short, vague, dozens of them, all for young people, many marked sudden illness, accidental fall, or drowned, and all day within a few years of major Caldwell land acquisitions or charitable settlements. I thumbed through them with rising nausea, and my hand froze on one. A girl named Annie Fielder, 16, who had drowned in the quarry behind the estate in 1986. The same year my grandfather signed over part of the orchard of the town for public use, an act praised in the local paper as a gesture of goodwill following years of private ownership. Clara leaned in and whispered, "That wasn't goodwill, that was payment." And I knew then that the ledgers in the house didn't record theft. They recorded agreements, silent ones, unspoken deals that kept the town afloat while ensuring no Caldwell ever answered for anything. I thanked her, promised I would keep her name out of anything I revealed, and walked back to the estate under a moonless sky, the weight of every name I'd read pressing against my chest like stone sewn into fabric. And when I entered the house, it felt warmer, not inviting, but satisfied, like it had known I would learn this and had merely waited for me to catch up. I went straight to the study, opened the cabinet again, and this time didn't just read. I cataloged name by name, date by date, matching them with the obituaries Clara had provided, and every match made me feel more complicit, more claimed, more bound to a history I had never consented to but now bore like a second skin. I called out my father's name in the empty room, not in anger but in disbelief, asking how I could have lived in this house, breathed this air, read these same pages, and said nothing, done nothing, stopped nothing. And the only answer I received was the ticking of the clocks, all slightly out of sync, like time itself was shrugging its shoulders. I found an old map of the state in the bottom drawer of the desk, marked with faded red, that corresponded not to buildings, but to locations, orchards, woods, the old mill foundation, and something labeled only cistern, which I hadn't seen before. I circled it and made a note to find it in daylight. And as I sat back in the chair, exhausted, reeling, and yet somehow more awake than I had felt in years, I understood with a sick certainty that the Caldwells had never built their fortune on success. They had sustained it through subtraction, through disappearance, through the kind of sacrifices that no one talked about but everyone felt, and that my return had not been a mistake or a coincidence or a gift. It was a transaction, a continuation, a name shifting hands without ever letting go. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid of the house, though there were moments when I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, imagining it thinning until floorboards above me were just paper holding the weight of something vast and watchful, but because I couldn't stop thinking about the names, about the rhythm of those ledgers, the finality of the word cleared, the cruelty of its simplicity, how a single line on a page could outlive a child, a family, a truth. I spent the early hours tracing the map I'd found, marking every location listed with red pencil, then cross-referencing each with the obituaries Clara had given me. But as the sun began to rise in thin orange streaks behind the lace curtains, something began to gnaw at me. Not all the deaths had locations, and not all the locations had names, which meant something was missing, something intentional. And when I returned to the ledger, cabinet to start again from the beginning, I noticed it. One book that didn't match the others, slightly thinner, bound in darker leather, no decade on its spine. I pulled it out and immediately knew this was different. The pages inside weren't lined, weren't formatted like the others, and they weren't written in my father's or Elias's neat clinical hand, but in a Messier scrawl, uneven, rushed, almost panicked. It began with a date, March 7, 1922, and a line that read, "These are the ones who will not be counted, but must never be forgotten," followed by a list of names, first names only, some followed by small details. Jane, red ribbon, age 5, Thomas, birthmark right cheek, Eddie, stuttered when scared. And as I turned page after page, the list continued, hundreds of names with minimal identifiers, no dates of settlement, no location markers, no mention of debt, only small human fragments. Like someone had tried to preserve what little they could before was all lost. I read it twice, slower the second time, and felt my chest tighten with each line, not because of what was written, but because of what wasn't. These were not debts repaid or accounts settled. These were lives taken without being recorded, erased so completely they had to be hidden even from the ledgers. And I realized that the Caldwells hadn't always documented their silence. There had been a time, a decade perhaps, when the system wasn't polished, when erasure left traces, and someone, an outlier, a relative, a staff member, a dissenter, had tried to make a record in secret. The book ended without a final entry, just a half-written name, Lease, the pen line trailing off as if interrupted, and the back cover was smeared with something that looked like ink but smelled faintly of iron and mold, and I closed it gently, hands shaking, unsure whether I'd found confession or a prayer, and each one more desperate than the last. One from a woman named Marnie begging whoever discovered the note to tell her son that she'd tried to come back. Another from a man named Allen describing his work in the Caldwell orchard and how he began to notice that certain workers weren't seen again after being called to the house. And one letter, the oldest, simply said, "They don't bury them here. They sink them." That line chilled me to my bones because I remembered the cistern marked on the map, the only location I hadn't yet explored, and something about the phrasing, the deliberate vagueness of it, sounded like a warning passed through generations, softened by time but sharpened by repetition. I photocopied the letters, tucked the originals back where I found them, and left the study without turning off the lamp, because the idea of plunging that room back into darkness felt wrong, like closing a casket on voices that had only just begun to speak. I spent the rest of the morning cataloging the Book of Absence digitally, creating an archive on my laptop, even though I knew no search engine would ever return these names. No genealogy site would match these children to graves, because they were never allowed to exist outside this place, never acknowledged by the very house that had claimed them in silence. I tried to trace surnames based on context clues, made lists of townspeople whose family lines ended abruptly in the census records, and with every thread I pulled, the pattern grew clearer. The Caldwells had built their wealth not just on land and labor and inheritance, but on omission, on the quiet commodification of lives that left no legal shadow. And through it all, I kept returning to my name in the current ledger, pending, and the gnawing sense that I hadn't been summoned here to inherit, but to complete something, to fulfill a balance left unsettled. And the more I thought about it, the more I wonder if that final, incomplete name in the Book of Absence, Lease, had been someone meant to be remembered, or someone whose act of remembering had doomed them. The air in the house grew heavier by evening, the kind of weight that presses down on your shoulders and makes each room feel slightly smaller, and I found myself opening every window in the east wing just to breathe, even though the air outside was cold and thick with the smell of rain-soaked earth. I stood at the threshold of the old parlor, watching the curtains sway like slow breath, and I asked out loud, not to the house, but to myself, how many more are there? And in that moment, I didn't expect an answer, but I felt something shift in the hallway behind me. A floorboard creak, not ominously, but deliberately, and when I turned, nothing was there, only the long corridor leading back to the study, where the ledger still sat open, still waiting, as if I hadn't left. I slept on the couch. That night, too afraid to be far from the names, from the voices that had finally found paper again, and before I closed my eyes, I whispered into the dark, "I see you. I won't forget." And for the first time since I returned, the silence felt less like indifference and more like acknowledgement. IT was just past noon when I set out across the back fields of the Caldwell estate, armed with only the brittle old map, a flashlight, and the kind of cold determination that comes when grief hardens into purpose, because after days of reading names, of matching faces to voids in the town's memory, of discovering that some people weren't just forgotten, but erased with precision, I couldn't ignore the final unmapped piece of the puzzle. The cistern, marked on the lower corner of the estate in red ink so faint it was almost a whisper, tucked near the edge of the orchard where the trees had long since grown wild and gnarled, and the land sloped downward toward a patch of dense, weedy thicket that I had never once been allowed to play near as a child. The walk took longer than expected, not just because of the terrain, but because the silence out there was different, deeper, older, almost hollow, as if the ground itself didn't want to be walked on. And as I pushed through the brush and brambles, I saw it. A moss-covered stone ring about 6 feet wide, half sunk into the earth, its surface cracked and discolored, but unmistakably man-made. And as I approached, I realized it wasn't a well. It was something else, something older, a structure designed not to draw water but to hold something in. I knelt beside it, cleared the vines away, and found the rusted iron cap, still sealed tight, with a corroded latch that resisted my touch like it hadn't been opened in decades. And as I pried it loose with a crowbar I'd brought from the tool shed, the metal groaned and gave way with a hiss of stale, foul air that hit me like a slap, thick with the rot of age and something darker, something chemical, like decay preserved deliberately. I pulled the lid back fully and peered into the darkness, shining my flashlight down into a stone chamber 10 feet below, dry now lined, with circular stone and sloping slightly at the base where something gleamed faintly beneath the grime and dust. I lowered myself down the crumbling ladder, my heart thudding in my throat, and as my boots touched the ground, I realized the floor wasn't earth. It was tile, partially buried beneath silt and leaves and time, but unmistakably tiled, and etched along its surface were names, dozens of them, carved by hand, shallow and uneven, but legible. Names I recognized from the Book of Absence, names that weren't supposed to be recorded at all, and in the center, something worse, a series of small wooden doors, stacked vertically like drawers, each sealed with rusted latches, and I knew, without opening them, what they were. I opened one anyway, with shaking hands, and inside was a child's shoe, a photograph, a lock of hair tied in ribbon, and a yellowing scrap of paper with a birth date and the word "taken" written in red ink, and I dropped the drawer in horror, stumbling back and hitting the wall, where a second revelation awaited me. Etched into the stone behind me was a Caldwell crest, worn but visible, and beneath it, a plaque so corroded I could only read part of it, "In service of equilibrium. Let none be left unbalanced." I don't remember climbing out, not fully. The next thing I knew I was back in the study, the dirt still on my knees, my breath coming in shallow bursts, and I realizing that everything I thought was a metaphor, the ledgers, the idea of debt, of balance, of repayment, had not been symbolic at all. What had been raised wasn't just wealth or power or silence. It was an entire system of barter, an inheritance built not on what was earned, but on what was extracted generation after generation. And for every orchard planted, every road paved, every gift given to the town, something had been taken. Lives, futures, children, and stored like relics, like currency in that cistern, that crypt, that hidden bank of innocence robbed and catalogued and sealed with family crest that no longer felt like mine but like a curse carved into bone. I tore through the study that night, rereading every journal, every financial record, and found the proof in plain sight. Euphemisms for disappearance, equilibrium maintenance, social offset, unrecorded discharge, and always the same conclusion. The estate owed nothing, because the estate collected everything. In the back of one ledger, dated 1987, I found a chilling note from my grandfather that read, "We never take more than what is offered. They bring them to us now. It's cleaner." And I understood then that the town had never been innocent, that every gnawed and silent gaze I'd received in the diner, every warning cloaked in metaphor, had not been fear of me, but fear of the debt, of the balance shifting again, of the cycle being disrupted, or worse, reignited. And at the center of it all was my name, Eloise Caldwell, marked pending, not because I was the next to be sacrificed, but because I was the one expected to continue the cycle, to choose, to record, to settle the next account. And I fell to my knees in the middle of that cursed study and wept, not because of what my family had done, but because deep down I knew the ledger would not close itself, and someone somewhere was waiting for the next line to be written that I didn't leave the house for 3 days after finding the cistern, Not because I was physically trapped, but because something in me had fractured in a quiet, irreparable way, and moving beyond the estate's gates suddenly felt like a betrayal of those. Names etched into the stone below. Like stepping away from them was a refusal to carry what I now knew. I moved to the house in silence, speaking aloud only when reading from the Book of Absence or whispering names I committed to memory. Small rituals that kept me tethered, kept me human. And on the third morning, after a night of dreamless, unrestful sleep on the study floor, I returned to Cabinet of Keys and stared at the one labeled North Tower, a place I hadn't yet explored. Not out of neglect, but because I'd assumed the upper levels were just storage, old furniture, and portraits too large to discard. But the key felt warm in my hand, as if its time had come, and I followed the winding staircase to a narrow, locked door at the end of the corridor so dust-choked it looked like the house itself was trying to seal it off. The key turned stiffly, the lock groaning like it hadn't been touched in decades, and when the door creaked open, I was met with a smell I couldn't place. At first, aged cedar and something dry, almost sweet, like paper warmed by sunlight too long. But it was a room beyond that rooted me to the floor, a small octagonal chamber with a single window, its panes so thick with grime the outside world looked sepia-toned, and lining the walls were rows of wooden cubby-like shelves, each one filled not with books or files, but with objects, tokens, each meticulously labeled in fading ink, a porcelain button, a lock of baby hair, a crayon drawing, a tiny knit mitten, a rusted harmonica, a photograph folded so many times the edges had disintegrated into lace. There were hundreds of them, arranged like an archive of vanished lives, each one bearing only initials and a year, and as I stepped further inside, the air seemed to close around me, not menacing but solemn, like I'd entered a church built for memory alone. I moved shelf to shelf, reading the labels. LF, 1952, MT, 1971, H, 1944, and every so often I recognized a set of initials from the Book of Absence, but here they were not erased. They were preserved, commemorated in silence, as if someone had tried to hold on to them after the ledgers had moved on. In the center of the room stood a tall cabinet, locked with a sliding panel, and when I opened it, I found the final and most disturbing collection. A row of wooden tokens, each no larger than a poker chip, engraved with names, full names this time, not just initials, and among them, alphabetized and sorted by decade. I found a token labeled Eloise Caldwell, 1992, the year I turned 7, the year my mother left my father, the year we vanished from the estate and never spoke of again. And as I held it in my palm, something inside me snapped, not in panic, not in madness, but in clarity, because I understood now that I hadn't just returned to the Caldwell estate by inheritance. I had been drawn back, pre-selected, my name inscribed long before I was old enough to know what that meant, and my childhood escape had only delayed the process, left the balance unresolved. Behind the tokens were journals, leather-bound and locked, each with a single year etched into the spine, and I pulled down the one marked 1992 and opened it with shaking fingers, reading entry after entry in my father's hand. Observations, reflections, doubts. Eloise shows signs of disobedience. Her absence may disrupt future settlements. Recommend reassessment in adulthood. And I realized he watched me not as a daughter, but as a variable, appending some of the moral equation he never questioned, only balanced, and my chest burned with grief too large to weep, too hollow to scream. I sank to the floor of that room surrounded by fragments of the forgotten, holding my own token like a piece of someone else's nightmare, and I asked aloud, why me? But I knew the answer, the same reason as all the others. Because it was easy, because the system worked when no one asked questions, because wealth, once acquired, becomes a thing protected at any cost. And families like mine had learned long ago that silence was cheaper than truth. I placed my token back in its slot, hands trembling, and left the room without locking it, because doors like that should never be closed again. And as I descended the tower, each step fell heavier, my name now echoing alongside every other, not because I was chosen, but because I had been allowed to live long enough to choose differently. And I knew then that my next move would not be quiet, that I still remember the first ritual I uncovered, an empty glass jar filled only with soil, placed atop a pedestal in the chapel room behind locked doors, a place no one had mentioned, and I stumbled upon it one evening, drawn by a clicking sound like careful handling, the door turning under my finger as though expecting me, And inside the small, vaulted space, the hush was oppressive, stained, glass windows painted with family crests, kneelers upholstered in deep burgundy, and in the center, that jar on a velvet cloth, dust coating it but not concealing the fine, dark earth inside, and tucked beside a handwritten note that bore a date decades old and a single instruction: return the balance. Barry would have been lost. And suddenly I understood the meaning behind the cryptic bookkeeping language: social offset, unrecorded discharge. These weren't euphemisms. They were instructions. Debt was not just taken. It was cleansed, absolved through ceremony. And the Caldwells believed that if they performed the ritual properly, they would be free of guilt of balance owed. I spent the next days scouring the estate for more jars, more tokens, more signs, and they were everywhere. One in the study behind a false panel, another hidden in the conservatory among broken urns, a third buried in the garden under the hedge maze, each jar filled with disparate contents: soil samples, torn fabric, candle wax, each with instructions in my father's handwriting. Pour in earth at midnight. Pray for clarity. Feed the jar a single blue ribbon and recite. Open every seventh moon. And I realized these were not abhorrent rituals but obsessive pens. Attempts to sanctify disappearance, to cleanse a ledger not with repentance, but with theatrics, as though guilt were a currency that could be returned by performance. I tried one. At midnight under a new moon, I slipped into the garden, knelt by one jar and poured in a handful of earth, recited the words: balance be reversed, return. No wind stirred, no thoughts left me, no burden lifted. I returned inside with clay staining my jeans and a pit of anger in my chest, because this was no absolution. It was the illusion of absolution, a theater set for one, and performer was a Caldwell name. The more jars I discovered, the more elaborate the rituals became. One chamber held dozens of tokens, each tied with ribbon and buried in soil inside glass spheres. Another had a basin filled with black water and a bell. Ring once for each name, said the note, and I tried it once, and the copper clang of the bell echoed so loud I felt it in my bones, and I thought I saw ripples in the water, organic something rising beneath it, and I fled. In the chapel I found books bound in leather, each page detailing ritual instructions tied to names. Annie Fielder, blue ribbon, candle, prayer forgiveness. Michael Tanner, Appleseed planted at sight of death. And I realized the rituals weren't about releasing guilt. They were about preventing the memory from rising without permission. They were screenplays, ceremonial defenses against exposure, and most chillingly, they were written in my handwriting too, one book merely labeled Eloise Caldwell, with empty checklist items under October nights, moonlight, burial of ribbon, recitation of my name, each task unchecked, unfinished, awaiting completion. My own name inscribed as a symbol of future absolution I was expected to enact. I sat cross-legged on the cold chapel floor, tears burning, realizing the ritual cycle was not forgiveness. It was reenactment, a way for the Caldwells to institutionalize forgetting, more invested in process and redemption. And as I read, I felt my father's voice, his careful justifications, echoing in the corridors. It's tradition, he'd say. It's how we hold company with our losses. And I felt fury. I felt grief. I felt betrayal. I felt the full weight of my inheritance. Not land, but legacy of erasure and performance and guilt. And I understood then that I had a choice. Continue performances, pick up where the ceremonies left off, join the chain and bury my silence under ritual, or shatter the cycle altogether, refuse the ceremonies and confront the ledger nakedly, publicly, without absolution or theater. I locked every jar and closed every door but left them unlocked, so someone would find them without disturbance. So history could breathe without the theater, and I came to bed that night with a void where relief might have been, and I dreamt not of rituals but of voices. One voice so small saying, balance is not buried. And I woke determined not to bury names in jars but to speak them aloud, and in that determination the house shifted around me, not with sound, or perhaps with the softest creak of acceptance, as if even these walls recognized that ritual wasn't remedy but refusal, and now, at last, they were listening to me to I won't lie. The discovery left me breathless, and not just out of dread, but a deeper, more visceral ache, because on the nights after I learned about the cistern, the tokens, the jars, I couldn't stop asking myself what happened to the Caldwell children who came before me, the ones whose names weren't pending because they'd never returned. and I knew I had to find out, even if the answers tore my heart into fragments, because inheritance had become less about property and more about disappearance, and I refused to let my name join that list without knowing how others had escaped or been consumed. I began poring over the archives again, this time seeking personal traces, not ledger entries, old graduation programs, yearbook photos, newspaper clippings, family scrapbooks tucked away in unused drawers. And what I found was a catalog of absence disguised as history. There was Miriam Caldwell, my aunt by blood, reportedly brilliant and kind, pictured smiling in a 1957 high school composite, inspiration of local girls, her future described as bright. Then, no college announcement, no career mention, no obituary, just silence following the photograph, as though she'd stepped off the printed page into thin air. And then my great-uncle Leonard, whose engagement announcement made it into the paper in 1972, describing him as tall, handsome, caring. But the engagement was abruptly broken off, and weeks later he disappeared, presumed drowned on a boating accident, though none of his family ever confirmed seeing the body. Years later, another Caldwell, Sarah in the 80s, was institutionalized for nervous breakdown. The articles vague, the record sealed, but whispered rumors that she had walked into the woods with a ledger and never returned. And I added each of them, name by name, to my private ledger of missing heirs, mapping them on a house blueprint, connecting them by date and decade, noting similarities. All left behind journals, scrapbooks, gift ledgers, but none left behind explanations. And every time a Caldwell heir struck out alone, something happened. Someone erased them, whether by ledger, by ritual, or by their own unraveling. I tracked down an old housekeeper, now in her 80s and living in a shabby apartment near the bus station, her hands shaking as she recalled the ones who came and didn't stay. And I pressed her, asking about Leonard, about Sarah, about Miriam, and she blinked away tears before whispering, they got ahead of the debt. They couldn't settle what was owed themselves, so the estate took them back. And I understood this was not figurative. This was outcome-driven. They either disappeared, or they were erased through ceremony, madness, or forced departure. I sat in my room that night, crying not for them, but for the ritual of erasure itself, how it turned family into data, children into balances, and heirs into options to be activated or sealed away, depending on compliance or resistance. And as I cried, I realized I had two paths: become another disappearance, or become the witness who refused to vanish. The next day, I retraced the old paths of these heirs. Miriam's former bedroom still smelled of dust and lavender when I unlocked it. The mirror still polished. The diary left open on her desk. Final entry in faded ink. I can't do it. I can't. They're watching. I closed it gently, knowing that whatever drove her to silence had followed her name into oblivion. Leonard's old studio, now unused. Still had easels, half-finished portraits, and on the canvas, the last attempt at self-expression. His own eyes staring back at me, hollow, betrayed, holding the ledger's truth in brushstroke. Sarah's room held scores of notebooks, torn pages, and pressed flowers, but no sign of patterns. I found blackened candle wax on the floor, and on the wall scratched the word, balance 5 times. I combed every wing of the house, felt the grooves of erasure etched into the woodwork, the dust hiding every word these ancestors had used to say goodbye, and I began to feel like I was unraveling their erasure by retracing their steps, their fear, their refusal. I began to think I would find them somewhere, maybe living under a different name, maybe insane in a remote asylum, maybe lying under woodland leaves, but I never did, and each absence spoke louder than any confession would, because it said that the ledger didn't just record debts, it enforced them with finality, and yet something else emerged, a pattern of resistance. Miriam's diary contained crossed-out passages that became braver over time, a shift in language, a refusal to comply. Sarah's notebooks were filled with numbers, yes, but also poetry she wrote in secret, hidden beneath ledger entries. The estate record showed Leonard had sold an entire parcel of land shortly before his disappearance, one that, judging by the ledger dates, could have covered multiple debts at once. These were acts of desperation, not compliance. They were attempts to balance the ledger by choice, not extinction. And something in that discovery gave me hope. Heirs didn't always vanish. They sometimes fought back, and the price wasn't always silence. It could be liberty, self-erasure, or self-determination. But those paths had always ended in some form of absence, and now, faced with the ledger and the cistern and the chapel jars, I felt the weight of choice shifting onto me, and the estate itself seemed to lean quiet, as if listening, waiting for my next move, whether I would be another statistic in the ledger or a voice beyond it. When I decided to confront the town, to shine a light on the ledger, the cistern, the missing heirs, and the jars of ritual at the heart of the Caldwell estate, I thought I would face anger or denial, but what I encountered instead was a different kind of horror. Apathy edged with guilt, shielding, wealth with indifference, and a communal pact written not in ink but in omission. I started small, meeting the mayor at his office, expecting indignation or outrage when I showed him the maps, the names, the ceremonies, but he listened politely, leaned back in his leather chair, sighed, and said, "This is old, generations old. People aren't talking about it anymore." I showed him the ledger with my name marked pending and the wooden urns full of ribbons and soil and ashes, but he offered only a thin smile. "Look," he said, "there's no law against a family burying heirlooms or keeping old ledgers. Nobody died on record. You've got yourself a mystery, not a crime." His eyes were weary, as though he'd been asked this before, and withdrew expectations, understanding this was something bigger than him. So I took my questions to the police chief, a man with calf-bruised arms, who nodded gravely and said he'd look into missing person cases. But months later the department closed the files for Miriam, Leonard, Sarah, citing insufficient evidence, and refused to open a new case on unsigned posted disappearances. They lacked bodies, timelines, or proof of wrongdoing. "We can't go digging through old legends," he told me. So I went to local journalists, showed them photographs of the cistern, the custodial jars, the book of absence, hoping someone would care. But they looked at me like I was a crazy heir chasing ghosts. "Your story's heavy, but we need cold facts," they said. "People read entertainment, not exposure." I realized then that cloak of invisibility was the ultimate weapon, and wealth was only effective when it is silent. I visited churches, posted flyers, scanned social posts, opened conversations about inherited wrongs and the moral debts we all carry. But conversations slowed to whispers, side eyes, laughter in groups, quick changes of subject. The townspeople built a wall of avoidance out of nerves and convenience and fear, and each time I drew closer, the wall shook but did not fall. I confronted the butcher next, the one who smiled thinly at me once, and he met my eyes steadily. "I don't want to lose the orchard or the annual fair," he said. "We're all connected here. Sometimes it's best not to rock the boat." The accountant told me the estate paid taxes, donated to school, funded the community theater. "Goodwill matters," she said. "Yes, oversight matters, but be fair." And with each defense, I felt the ledger's roots run deeper, built not just on debts paid in absence, but on goodwill that masked the gravity of what stood in shadow. I met the timid librarian, who whispered behind her hands. I found letters in the archives, notes about jars and tokens, but I was told to ignore them. I ignored them. I heard from a former mayor, now retired, who admitted, "We had opportunities to ask questions. No one stepped forward. Better let sleeping stones lie." And each admission widened the cavity at the heart of our relationships. Relationship built on shared silence, on collective choice to forget. Words like heritage and tradition were repeated as talismans, air-quick answers that the ledger took from others. But then, in the center of that silence, a fracture. A young teacher invited me into her classroom, holding my book of absence in her hands, trembling. "I won't let it go," she said. She promised to display the names, to let them speak. Small rebellion, but breach enough that town council put an emergency issue on record about the state. But the motion failed on a single vote. That night I stood at the gates of the Caldwell property, illuminated by moonlight, and thought, this is how debt survives generationally, through town's legal complacency, collective turning of heads, not by grand conspiracies, but by the everyday decision not to remember, to move on. And I realized at the end of the ledger, I needed more than evidence. I needed to break silence, compel attention, and maybe sacrifice what goodwill still exists, from myself and from town. Looking back at the dark wings of the house on the road, I whispered into the night, "We both know what silence takes. We decide whether it takes us to." And in that moment, I understood that some debts aren't just owed to individuals. They are owed a collective memory, to truth itself, and maybe that's the real reckoning I need to trigger. I began writing in the ledge of the night after the council's silence, after the town's unwillingness to listen, after the weight of every unanswered question I'd unearthed left me with only one undeniable certainty, that if no one would reckon with the debts of the Caldwell legacy, then I would, even if it meant losing my name, my mind, or whatever tethered me to life before I returned to this house. I took the largest ledger, the one marked ongoing, and cleared a space in the chapel where the air still smelled of burned wax and dry soil, where the jars sat like mausoleums of obedience. And I opened it to the last blank page, dipped a pen in fresh ink, and instead of recording payments or pending entries, I began writing names, not from the old books, but from memory, from the book of absence, from whispered stories Clara had told me, from photos I'd uncovered in the basement archive, from portraits whose brass nameplates had been removed. I wrote each name deliberately, with care, and beside them I did not write, cleared or pending, but taken, silenced, erased. And suddenly the book no longer felt like an instrument of wealth, but a memorial, a catalog of lost recontextualized as truth. The ink bled a little more with every name, the pages absorbing the grief like skin absorbing bruise. And as I wrote, I began to forget small things, dates, where I placed my keys, the time of day, but I pressed on, believing the writing itself was a protest, the refusal to comply. I wrote for hours, days, forgetting to eat, sleep, or answer the emails from lawyers, asking about the estate, and when I looked into the mirror, I barely recognized myself, my hands stained with ink, my eyes sunken, like the house itself had begun feeding off my resolve, try to reclaim me one name at a time. I started to hear voices, not supernatural whispers, but echoes of memories I never lived, fragment of the lost heirs. Sarah sang, "We are not currency," Miriam crying, "Let the names live," and Leonard screaming silently behind paint, his brush strokes turning to ledger, marks of my dreams over and over, until I woke gasping, fingers twitching like I was still holding a pen. I found my own name again in the original ledger, still marked pending, and for a long time I stared at it, the ink now fainter than I remembered, like it had faded in protest of what I was doing, and I took the red ink my grandfather once used and struck a line through it, not gently, but violently, tearing the paper slightly, and below it wrote, "Refused." It wasn't ceremonial, it was primal, and the moment I did, the chapel's air shifted heavier, like the house exhaled, no longer sure whether I belonged within it or not. Objects began appearing in strange places. A key I never used found in my pillowcase, a token jar opened and studied despite being sealed, my name scrawled backward on a fog mirror, and I knew it wasn't ghosts, but memory fighting back. The architecture of silence rearranging itself to test my will. I refused to stop writing, even as my vision blurred, even as nosebleeds streaked the pages, even as my voice began cracking from disuse. Because the truth was this: the house was not haunted. It was historical, a structure of emotional architecture built on denial, and my defiance was not only unwelcome, it was corrosive. The more I wrote, the more the house rejected me. With panels warped, windows stuck in one night, the staircase collapsed beneath me as I descended from the tower, as to try and keep me inside, but I crawled away, bones bruised, heart steady, because I'd written over 100 names, each one a flame of memory, and I wasn't finished. I dragged the ledger into foyer on the last night of that week, and set on the grand piano no one had played in decades, opened to the last page, and found a note, not mine, not my father's, but written in a hand I did not recognize. Your refusal will not erase the cost. Balance must be paid. Choose. And beside it, one last blank line, an empty name, waiting, pressing, daring me. I closed the book and carried it to the fire pit behind the orchard, poured oil over it, and watched it burn, not to destroy it, but to end its record, to free the names inside from servitude to silence. And as the flames crackled and turned the pages to ash, I screamed, not in fear, but in defiance. A scream so loud, I felt something inside the house tremble and still. When I returned, the ledger cabinet was empty, every book gone, and in its place a single note. You have rewritten what cannot be undone, and still something must be owed. I didn't sleep that night. Only sat in the study and stared at the space the ledgers once filled, now hollow, like a mouth that had swallowed too many names and grown silent in grief. And I wondered, not for first time, if some debts were not meant to be paid, but transformed by memory, by confrontation, by the refusal to let them sit quietly in the dark. It was a week after I burned the ledger when the final message came, slipped under the door of the study, while I slept slumped over the desk, not in an envelope, not typed, but handwritten in precise, immaculate script I recognized instantly, my father's, neat and deliberate even in death, though I had not seen it since the coroner's report and the boxes of the belongings were sent to me cold and incomplete. It read, "Eloise, if you're reading this, then you've gone further than I ever could. I left the books. I left the doors unlocked. But I couldn't do what you're about to. I couldn't choose. The debt is old, and it will claim one of us still. It always does. I hope you forgive me." That was all. No signature. No further explanation. Just a cruel, silent acknowledgement that everything he'd done, everything he'd left it uncover, had not been oversight. It had been orchestration, an incomplete resistance masquerading as detachment, and now the last decision rested with me. The estate had gone still after the fire. Quieter than ever, not empty but waiting, no more flickering lights, no misplaced keys, just a calm that felt surgical, expectant, as if the house had conceded my right to rewrite, but still demanded the ledgers. Terms be closed. I wandered the corridors in the days that followed, every room like a breath held too long, every creak with a clock ticking down, not toward doom, but toward decision, and I knew the choice was mine now. Either name someone to inherit the balance, to accept the weight I had refused, or step into the role myself, not as another keeper, not as continuation, but as the debt's last resting place. I found the final ledger, new, bound in blank casking, hidden behind the fireplace. Brick in the east wing, exactly where the youngest Caldwell heir had once hidden poems about fire and silence, and inside, one page, one line, one name box, empty, with a note etched in tiny letters below. The house does not close its doors without a keeper. That night, I stood at the gates of the estate, holding the book, holding my name like a coin that could tip one way or another, and I remembered every child whose initials I had copied, every heir who vanished trying to break free, every townsperson who chose silence over truth, and I asked myself the one question I had avoided from the beginning, not what I could uncover, not what I could burn or rewrite, but what I was willing to give, not for the estate, not for justice, but for closure, the kind that doesn't erase history, but ends it. I had no one to pass it to, no family, no heirs, and I refused to name someone else, refused to create a future burden just to walk away clean. So I made the only choice that could satisfy the estate and my conscience. I signed the book with my own name, not as pending, not as payment, but as keeper memory, and I closed it slowly, pressed my hand against the cover, and whispered, "But the terms change now. No more silence, no more taking." And I buried it deep in the earth under the old orchard, where roots had twisted too long around secrets, and for the first time, I felt the estate exhale, not in satisfaction, but in surrender. I returned the house and packed what little I owned. Aloud, without my chest tightening like a fist, was squeezing the air from me. Years of living in a quiet town 3 states away. Years of unpacking the legacy I had inherited not in money or land, but in memory, in loss, in silence. I chose to break even when no one asked me to. I lived simply, anonymously, under a name close enough to mine to keep me tethered, far enough to keep the story at bay, and I became a librarian because preserving names became a sacred task after all I had seen erased. And every time I logged a record or corrected a date in our archive, I remembered those names from the Book of Absence and wondered what lives they might have lived had the ledger never claimed them. The house still stood, of course. I'd read that much from real estate records and occasional whispers online. A decaying estate rich with history, as one blog described it, uninhabited but not quite abandoned, as if it too was caught between chapters, unsure whether it was a ruin or a monument. And occasionally someone from the town would reach out, an anonymous postcard, a letter with no return address, always thanking me, sometimes apologizing, always brief, as though writing too much might reignite the debt. But none of them ever said they wanted the truth told, not publicly, not loudly, because to do that would be to admit that the silent hadn't just lived in the walls of the state. It had lived in them, in their choices, their inheritance of forgetting. I never published the full story, though I wrote it many times, each draft ending the same way, with the names, a list too long and too sacred to fictionalize, and each time I finished, I would set the draft on fire in a small tin bucket behind my house, watching the paper curl and blacken, whispering the names one by one so they would not burn silently. I did it not for absolution, but remembrance, because that's what was raised at the Caldwell estate, not a house, not a legacy of wealth, but a scaffolding of silence, lifted one generation at a time without a single debt paid, only debts passed down in new forms, rituals, ledgers, decisions wrapped in tradition and sealed with the illusion of duty. The horror was never supernatural. It was systemic, human, familial, and it thrived because no one ever looked directly at it, because everyone who benefited chose not to examine the cost. And yet, as I aged and the memory of that house dulled just enough to stop jolting me awake at night, I began to wonder if maybe the debt I thought I inherited wasn't mine at all, if maybe I confused being a witness with being responsible, and in that slow realization I found peace, not because I believed the past had been resolved, but because I'd chosen not to hide it anymore. Sometimes, when the nights grow long and the air feels like it did back on that estate, thick, waiting, quiet, I walk the edge of the woods behind my home and listen, just in case, just to be sure, and though I hear nothing, I always speak. One name from the ledger aloud before heading inside, not because I think someone is listening, but because I remember when no one was, and I promised them that would never happen again. What was raised without a single debt paid was not just a house, but a legacy of forgetting built on bones of the missing. And my story isn't about tearing it down, but about refusing to build atop it ever again.